So welcome everybody to our latest edition of the Henry III Roundtable. I'm Darren Baker, together with historians John Marshall, Michael Ray, and Hugh Ridgway. We have been discussing for the past 4 episodes probably the most contentious issue of Henry's reign, which was namely foreigners or aliens at court and the amount of patronage he dispensed to them, the amount of power they had, and so forth. Now, we began with the 2 families of Henry, the Lusignans and the Savoyards. And so it seemed almost proper that we go on to probably the most famous of the foreigners who arrived at his court, namely Simon de Montfort. So last week in our part 1 of this series, we were talking about Simon and his coming to England, which I'll give a basic overview before we get into part 2 here, which is namely the onset of war and revolution under Henry III. So Simon was born around 1208. He came from a Crusader family. He arrived in England approximately around 1230. He was a protege of Ranulph de Blandeville, the Earl of Chester, rose very highly at Henry's court in the 1230s. Up to the point where Henry gave him his sister Eleanor in marriage, so that made him a brother-in-law of the king, a point which we emphasized last time. Some of this was the basis of Simon's power. But he fell out with the king, namely over misuse of his trust. He was banished from court. They reconciled during the Poitevin campaign. Well, more or less did. Actually, Simon had to come back to England and start currying favor again for that. But they had more or less settled their differences when in 1248 Simon was named to be Henry's governor of Gascony. That started out successfully, ended disastrously, namely by Henry putting Simon on trial for his harsh conduct. We can almost be guaranteed that Simon never forgave Henry for that. It was a deep humiliation for him. So the reconciliation between them through the 1250s, as John Madicott pointed out, was probably more or less artificial. So in the 1250s, Simon, we mostly see him acting as a diplomat for Henry. He goes on a mission to Scotland, a secret mission because we don't know what words he imparted to the king there. We see him starting to work on the upcoming Treaty of Paris. Otherwise, he's very much concerned with his own lands in England and Eleanor's lands. He does a swap of baronies, some of his in the south for those in the north. We can almost see him trying to establish a power base in the north. So all this brings us to 1257. Simon is a member of the council, and they're meeting at Windsor, and something very special happens at this time in February at Windsor. Something with the council and the oath. Anybody want to go with that? Hugh, I think that's something you specialize in, oaths.
I suppose what you see in early 1257 is the first expression of some concern by the king's councillors that Henry's finances may not quite add up, and also the need to perhaps begin some sort of, if you like, restraint mechanism on the king's distribution of patronage, and so also, of course, I think it's also some sort of beginning of realization that Henry needs to begin some program of reforms to meet the criticism of his that he periodically received in Parliament, and so this oath of the King's councillors was intended to provide just that. I mean, it's not just simply a reform of, or at least a statement that the king will perhaps restrain his behavior and exist within certain restraints, but also it contains some declaration royal officials, particularly sheriffs, would improve their conduct. So it seems to anticipate the provisions of Oxford. It's a very, very important moment, I think.
But doesn't this oath also reflect on the councillors themselves?
Well, yes, I think it did. I mean, I think it may have been some attempt to, I don't know, calm down tensions at court. Of course, we know it's a failure, but I think at least it shows some sort of concern by some councillors very close to the king. Simon de Montfort, no doubt somebody like Peter of Savoy, that something had to be done to improve the conduct of Henry's kingship.
Well, I'm not sure it's so much about conduct as much as it is about his debts, because we even see that in the coming reforms of 1258 in that very famous letter where he spells out that it's the king's debts that are more or less the driving force of reform.
What do you mean by the fact that
Well, he has to go on crusade.
Yes.
He has the Sicilian project. He has all the debts racked up from Montfort's tenure in Gascony. I mean, he's teetering on bankruptcy, it seems like. So, I mean, this is the crisis of 1258 actually starts in 1257, I think.
Well, I think people looking at royal finance dispute that, don't they? Because I seem to remember the work of people like James Collingwood. And I mean, David Carpenter's always argued that Henry's finances were not when he wasn't a bursting in money, but he was sailing a bit closer to the wind. But it may have been that the king wanted, for example, a grant of taxation from Parliament, or that was already being considered perhaps safe for the Sicilian business, and therefore some sort of gesture of reform would be the sort of quid pro quo for that.
Right.
I mean, that's about as much as we know really about the councillor's oath of that period, but it sort of does coincide with a time when things are hotting up around the king about a full distribution of patronage, and a number of people now beginning to sort of increase their pressure for land grants, and some sort of kind of restraint would be needed for that.
Yeah, we see this kind of hunkering down at court, because 1257 was in many ways as an eventful year as 1258. We see the failure of the Welsh expedition. We see the demands of the papacy on the Sicilian project. We see the beginnings of the famine. All these pressures start building up until finally we get into 1258, when we have even more problems with the Scottish Minority Council. So everything's building up. And of course, 1258, Henry summons Parliament. He's again going to ask for a tax for Sicily. But behind the scenes, Baronial Confederation has come together, because they more or less had it with Henry's Lusignan relatives, who have made out quite well. Anyone want to go with that? So what happens then in
we just make a very quick point there, is that certainly the barons in that oath were concerned about royal governance, but they weren't necessarily concerned about baronial governance. There is a distinction to make. They were quite concerned how the king was running the country, but not necessarily how they were running their own estates.
Yes, well, that's true. That's a difference between that and 1258. I think that's a very fair point. But I do think that this, the promise to reform the conduct of sheriffs and royal officials in the provinces, again, that does seem to anticipate 1258, I think.
Because also,
but you're right about that.
Well, one of the important points about the oath of 1257 is that the councillors should not approve of any alienations from the royal domain. And we of course see how Simon de Montfort gets into trouble with this. And one of the points made about 1258, in that they take power from the royal center among these councillors, is that they saw it as a land grab. I mean, Hugh, what was Richard declared? Didn't he have his eyes on Aymer's properties in the south there?
Yes, so I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Darren. I think that the oath that they were going to preserve the Crown's estate was probably at least in something that was taken seriously. I mean, both Peter of Savoy and John Mansell in 1259, for example, make a unique allusion to that oath in taken back in 1257, when they were stating their acceptance of the land grants made to Simon de Montfort in that year, and I think that this idea of that they were defending in some ways the royal estate was something that meant something quite serious to them, that they were helping the king by reform. They weren't sort of doing anything against the king. They were increasing the dignity and the sort of the quality of royal government.
Right.
And I think this was a very, very important motivation behind supporting baronial reform in 1258 as well.
And I think that I have to see Henry, certainly Edward with Henry, as more or less understanding the problem at hand, and therefore being a part of both 1257 and 1258. I mean, I know it's more or less the trend of the recent books on Henry and Simon that the barons march on him, they take his great seal, they put him and Edward in a corner for the next few months and do what they like. I think it's quite nonsense. It doesn't make any sense, actually. But is it asking too much to think that Henry, Edward, and the rest of the royals are actually a part of reform?
Well, I don't. I mean, well, I don't. I mean, Edward obviously opposed the provisions of Oxford in 1258. Well, it's hard to know what Henry thought, but I mean, basically, when you say that the barons took power in 1258, as you know, it wasn't the baronage in general. It was a group of royal councillors decided that they'd had enough of way things were going in royal circles, and they took control, leading, if you like, the English baronage. But I don't think the English barons as a whole had caused 1258. It was an internal courtier led coup.
Right. And
by the
so,
greater good.
with the input to some extent of Queen Eleanor, of course, as well.
Yes.
Right. So, okay. So we've more or less set the background now. We have this crisis starting, coming to a head in 1257. It continues into 1258 until we have more or less these provisions of Oxford, where Henry now is more or less just the lord of the council and not necessarily calling the shots anymore. So now this is the background for Simon de Montfort. And we see him first come into view after Henry and Edward agreed to the reforms, namely that Henry entrusts the Committee of 24, which are going to elaborate these reforms. He entrusts them with satisfying Simon's claims. So it's an extraordinary thing, I think, that this one baron is going to be given all this attention amongst these reforms. You have any idea why that came about?
Well, I think that it was, if you like, Montfort's price for supporting reform in 1258.
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, David Carpenter argues in his book that Montfort was very much behind the Council's Oath of 1257. Well, I don't think he was uniquely the cause behind that. There's no evidence that Montfort was particularly interested in reform of royal government before 1258. And after all, I mean, the deal that he'd been given to settle his governorship of Gascony included that he could call on the revenues of about half a dozen English shrievalties, and even have a say in the appointment of the sheriffs. So I mean, you know, the idea that Montfort really believed in the moderation of sheriffs' behaviour is not necessarily something which I would accept. He didn't really want soft sheriffs. He wanted the maximum income, didn't he, from those
Right.
counties?
But it proves the point that here at the very beginning of the Reform period, Simon is right in the middle of it, and this.
Oh yeah. I mean, he was. I mean, you know, it's of course in his archives that the so-called conspiracy, the document, the sworn conspiracy, is long exists. I mean, it's the one copy we have of it. I don't know whether it was a unique document. I mean, I can hardly believe all the conspirators just allowed Montfort to have one copy, and for himself, I'm sure that there were multiple.
Well, that's a good point, because Simon always seems to be these things sort of more or less appear out of his endeavors and not anybody else's. But anyway, the point is,
he was very Simon de Montfort was very interested in obviously his name and reputation.
right,
and
yeah, like his father was. Right.
That.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't think he was unique in having an archive. You know, as I showed in my recent article on Peter of Savoy, that Peter Savoy had archives as well.
Right.
And, you know, sure, a number of barons did, but it's a very interesting aspect of baronial mentality, or at least the mentality of great earls, that they were beginning to keep these archives.
Right.
But Montfort was I think particularly interested in these legal niceties and how they would reflect on his reputation in future.
Right. So Henry entrusts the committee with Simon's claims, and then the next entry comes up that Simon is being sent to France to finalize the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, and he goes with Peter of Savoy, Hugh Bigot, who is going to be soon named the justiciar, and also with two Lusignans. Absolutely incredible that Simon is and Hugh and also Peter of Savoy are conspiring against the Lusignans while going with them to finalize the ratification of the treaty. Anyway, John, would you tell us a little bit about that treaty, how it kind of fits into these events now?
Yeah, the treaty basically is an attempt to reset Capetian Plantagenet relations. You've seen this war going on and off since 1204, with Philippe Auguste having taken John's territory in France, and it's bad news for lots of parts of, shall we say, the francophone world, of which at that point England is very, very much a part. And it's an attempt to reset that and trying to put that on a firm footing. And the resolution, and in fact, it's probably worth saying that the resolution that they come to is neither side is happy with. It's criticised from the French side and from the English side.
Oh, was it criticized from the English side? Edward, yes, but he got it.
It's been criticised certainly very much since that. Basically, yes, you've given up Normandy.
Yes.
You've given
you're
up
talking about the
Actually,
100 Years' War.
Can
Yeah,
I offer something here? There were about half a dozen chronicles which contain very negative reportage on the Treaty of Paris, that it's a sellout. And you know, then there was a poem that was written as well, which said that Henry had had his seal changed, and of course, quite significantly, he'd given up wielding a sword on his seal, and instead he'd just been given some sort of scepter. You know, and this was the Treaty of Paris in a nutshell. You know, it was a sellout. Yes, there's a half a dozen of them.
Yeah, and
really?
you have Schwanville critical from the French side, that you've basically allowed this Plantagenet king to keep Gascony, to keep Aquitaine. So it's like most compromises, I think, in the world. I mean, it gets criticised from both sides. It probably is a compromise.
But there were periodic attempts that had been made, as late as 1257, really, to make at least a token bid that the king wanted to ask for his Norman lands back. And I don't know. I mean, in the Montfort's case, I think Montfort may have been a bit ambiguous about the whole thing. This is my own view, but I'm not sure how kosher it is. I mean, after all, I mean, people like Montfort were there in English court partly because they were useful, because, you know, in the event of a punch-up with France, they would be able to provide, there'd be military input. And Montfort, I suppose, may well have regarded himself as a sort of, you know, if you like, a natural Grand General of Henry's armies, with all his supposedly military abilities. You know, and now, of course, there was going to be no more war. You know, it was all going to be jaw. So I wonder whether this is something which helps to bring Montfort to his senses. You know, where is Montfort going to go now?
We see this breach between Peter of Savoy and Simon de Montfort over this treaty, because Peter of Savoy effectively thinks that Simon is risking this whole treaty for his own personal gain.
Yes. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think Peter of Savoy, you know, if anything, wanted, you know, he was driven by this idea to secure everything for the Lord Edward, and the whole point of the Treaty of Paris, of course, was to secure Edward's appanage, and very important.
Not just that, but basically, Henry has become a realist. He's not going to get those French lands back.
No.
And the only way to more or less restore the dignity of his family is to find an alternative, which becomes Sicily. And basically, you know, to have his crusade, which he has to go on and which is going to cost a lot of money, and to switch it there. So that's more or less become the focus. And the Treaty of Paris is meant to facilitate that, with Louis providing Henry with enough money to get a core army together, possibly providing passage through France.
Absolutely. So that was another, you know, it's absolutely, it's all tied up together.
Right.
So when we see what we're going to see, this baronial party, these oath takers, this is where we first see these oath takers start to split apart. So it's relatively, they've taken that oath. It's just 12 months, 18 months or so later. There are already cracks in this baronial party.
Well, this more or less comes about because the Committee of 24 never addressed Simon's grievances for land, and then
well, hang on a minute. They did, didn't they? They set up a commission.
Okay, they set up a commission, but that was it.
Well, they did. Well, they awarded him £400 worth of land in.
But that was an emergency. That came, first of all, it came after the split with the Savoyards, when Simon's completely
No, Peter of Savoy was on the committee which actually awarded him that land. I think that actually it's terribly significant, actually, because if you actually sort of clock up who made the most money out of the, you know, who gained the most out of the provisions of Oxford privately, it was Simon de Montfort. £400 worth of land is the equivalent of a pretty major barony.
Right, but first let's go back. First of all, we come 6 months after the treaty should have been ratified. Henry should go abroad. He should go abroad to ratify it with his brother Richard, King of Germany, and Louis. And the council grounds him. They said, no, it's too dangerous. The king will come back with his Lusignan brothers. Now, who goes in his place? It's a delegation led by Simon de Montfort. So I cannot help but think that Simon planted everything in the treaty and within the council to stir up this distrust against Henry, so that he could take center stage here and that he could use the treaty for his purposes. Make much sense?
Quite possibly this is the Cambrai meeting, I think,
right.
of late
in Cambrai, yeah, right.
Yeah, Cambrai, yes. Yeah, well, quite possibly. I mean, as far as I know, but it's a mysterious aspect of the whole thing. But
right, but then Simon comes home. He comes home. Or before he comes home, he makes his will, and his will is a very interesting read, because we see him more or less announcing that he's going to do right by the poor of the land and so forth. And then he browbeats the barons into enacting the next stage of reforms, which is namely baronial oversight. But right after that is where this punch-up happens between him, the Savoyards, and Richard de Clare. They want the treaty ratified. And Simon refuses. He refuses to give Eleanor's renunciation. And we have that very famous scene when they're in France and Simon and the Earl of Gloucester are getting into a fist fight in front of the French.
Yes.
And so, as you say, there's a commission. They try to satisfy him. They try to give him this land.
Yes.
And
The
that's
Earl of
where
Gloucester, the Earl of Gloucester's it's really peculiar, really, because Richard declared only begun relatively recently to show an interest in foreign affairs. And I suppose what you're beginning to see is a kind of bid for leadership, aren't you, within the baronial council between these great earls. And I suppose Richard de Clare sort of, you know, this is what a lot of this is all about, isn't it?
well, he had 5 times more wealth than Simon. So
Yes. Yes.
But
yes.
the point being is that here we have Simon more or less isolated in the spring of 1259, because by this time Edward has renounced claims. So Simon is alone, and this commission awards him and Eleanor this land, these 10 manors. And that's where, as we made the point, it was said that, hey, Simon, you took an oath in 1257 not to permit alienations from the royal domain, which you are doing. So, but it comes to a great head in July of 1259 when Simon, I believe he was in France at the time, they gave that notice to the commission that they were looking for 25,000 pounds in back pay for Eleanor's dower, an incredible sum.
Yeah. Well, it's the way in which Montfort you like to negotiate, isn't it? Sort of, you know, it's a bit like negotiating Brexit, isn't it? You know, dealing with him, you know, he just sort of ups the ante.
But here's the thing: the people who should award him land are all martial descendants, and they're looking for martial land. So they're going to have to disgorge in order to make Simon happy, and they're not going to. But the point about the money is that Simon, as one of the negotiators of the treaty, he knows that Louis is going to pay Henry 33,000, some incredible sum of money for this army of knights. And I'm almost convinced that Simon is going to work to have that money used to satisfy his claims. And of course, it doesn't happen.
Can I make a point here about Montfort's behaviour? Simon de Montfort's an old man in a hurry, isn't he, by this stage? Right. Because he's getting on a bit, and he's starting to worry about his sons. And of course, he had a number of sons, and I think I'd like to say one of the most peculiar aspects of Montfort's career by that stage is that he hadn't managed to find a place for his sons in the sort of hierarchy of Henry's court. Yeah. Particularly in the household of the Lord Edward, the future king. And I've never managed to understand why this was. And I'm sure it was very much in Montfort's mind, because, you know, Henry of Almaine, Richard of Cornwall's son, was already friendly with Lord Edward. But, you know, you don't see anything about Montfort's sons. Very, very peculiar, that. And, you know, you'd expect them to.
Well, you're right that he's in a hurry also in the sense that Simon is very much concerned with his legacy, because he, you know, we all know, or they all knew at that time, that his father was the most famous general of his day. His brother Amari was the Constable of France, and so well liked by the French monarchy that they paid off his 10,000 pounds of debt before he went on crusade. They know his cousin Philip is one of the principal Lord Barons of the Holy Land. And here's Simon: what have I accomplished? You know, I had my chance in Gascony, that ended in failure. Now here is basically my last chance.
It may have been that he was, of course, thinking of going on crusade again. Well, I mean, because, you know, he was going to go on crusade when he was appointed to Gascony, and of course had to set that aside for that reason. Yeah. So, of course, there is this serious now that Montfort was always committed to going on crusade, and he was trying to raise funds for it. And of course, the idea of making restitution, or at least promising restitution to those who he defended, in his will. That's all part and parcel of it, imitating Louis IX and so on.
But
I mean, I quite like that idea. I think Montfort is sort of no doubt is covering a number of options in this period.
But the end result we have here is that he's not going to get the money. He's not going to be able to block the treaty. He even goes so far as the Parliament of October 1259 to try and win over Edward's support. That if his claims are not satisfied, then Edward will more or less, Edward was also disgruntled at this time.
Yes, his famous compact with the Lord Edward.
Right.
And Gloucester tried to compact with Edward earlier on, but it not really worked. Yes.
Right, but this more or less seems the point where Edward, who doesn't go to France with his parents for the treaty, this is where Edward starts to assert himself as more or less independent of his parents' household. And this, of course, will be the beginning of a lot of problems for Henry and Eleanor, because as a point I always like to make, if Edward had been an obedient and dutiful son, things never would have come to the head that they did. But anyway, so the treaty is ratified. Yes. Simon is very angry. He takes leave of, he doesn't even take leave of Henry, just, he doesn't even recognize him as his lordship anymore. And he goes back to England with Edward. And wait a minute, John, isn't this the point where they kick Peter of Savoy off the council?
Yes, it is. It's coming up, and it's whilst he's away. So yeah, and this is the result of this rift that we've been describing with the Treaty of Paris. Simon is basically very unhappy at this rift, and yeah, this is again what, as we said earlier, this is this rift in this oath-taking baronial pact.
Right.
Yeah. I think Simon was also very cross with Peter of Savoy, because Peter of Savoy, as we mentioned, I think before, had pulled a fast one over the Treaty of Paris, that he managed to get the Duke of Brittany to renounce his claims on Richmond in return for receiving the revenues of the Agenais, once they'd been valued, of course, under the terms of the Treaty of Paris. So the result was, of course, Peter of Savoy done quite well out of the Treaty of Paris.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, but one of the interesting points about this resistance that develops in London while Henry is away is that Simon, basically, he's demanding that Henry come home to have Parliament even without the king.
Yes.
But during that month in London, there was that incident where 3 Italian clerks were murdered in broad daylight outside of St. Paul's. And this was part of the ongoing disputes about patronage for the church, for foreigners versus Englishmen. And it's interesting that Simon is in London when this flash of violence happens. And
yes,
there is no retribution for. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. And that I'm wondering how much Simon saw in this flash of violence against foreigners as maybe one of the ways to go forward.
Yes. Also, it's interesting, there was an attack on the Jews as well in London at that point. I can't really remember the details now, but I remember seeing something. Yeah, it's all sort of redundant to the later Montfort, isn't it? Yeah.
But
and of course, it's typical of Simon that he would begin to resort to arms. I mean, that's a good one of the insights of David Carpenter's article on Simon de Montfort. Montfort really is ultimately somebody who isn't afraid to resort to arms.
Well, I mean, and that's a very good point, because it kind of, when I look at David's second volume, I mean, clearly the admiration for Simon it leaps out of the page. So where we are now is Henry is going out to hire a mercenary force to come back to England and force his son Edward back into obedience and to deal with Simon de Montfort. Now, one of the things I mentioned about Simon, that he liked to talk big, and thinking of last night's debates in the US, this all comes to mind. And here we have Simon say later during one of his depositions that if Henry comes back with a mercenary force, he will give them a welcome like no other.
Yes.
Well, here Henry lands and Simon is nowhere in sight. So yeah, the end result of that is Henry reasserts his authority. Edward claims he wasn't being disobedient, and he's more or less reinstated in royal favor.
There's at least one chronicle which actually does show that the forces of Edward de Montfort were quite substantial, but they obviously weren't enough.
No,
And
I think
you're absolutely right.
Henry has an idea to put Simon on trial for sedition. It doesn't happen because there is an insurgency in the Welsh marches, and basically once that is resolved, Parliament meets in October. Henry is sort of adamant about where reform is going, especially because he's not able to name his ministers. Richard de Clare, Simon de Montfort, and Edward more or less make this pact where they water down reforms against barons in return for more control over the king. But Henry, Simon goes abroad, Edward goes abroad, and the council is more or less gutted by the end of 1261. So that, 1260. So that brings us into 1261, a very important.
Well, can I just say,
sure.
This isn't really quite the case, is it? Because you could argue that actually what happens in the October 1260 Parliament is something that is very favourable to Simon de Montfort.
Yes.
After all, you have a new justiciar elected who's very much a sort of an adherent of Simon de Montfort, Hugh le Despencer, and you have a beginning. You have then an extension of the heirs, isn't it? Of the justiciar, which actually goes into Sussex and rattles very much Peter of Savoy's cage in Sussex. And other measures of that nature, and you have also full sessions of the council as well in this period. So I think the provisions of Oxford certainly were not dying at that point. In fact, they seem to be rather too alive and kicking, weren't they?
I think it's just worth saying as well, it's a good time not to leave the country because Peter of Savoy is removed from the council during his absence in Helvetia. And then, of course, Simon leaves the kingdom, Peter comes back, and then Peter is whispering in Henry's ear with Richard how to get rid of the provisions of Oxford. Yes. So, yes. Absence from the kingdom is not good at this point.
No.
Well, I wonder if I can just. Am I on? Yeah.
Yeah, you're there, Michael.
When Simon goes off to France, it always struck me he went off in a bit of a hissy fit. He said that he wouldn't live in a country where people broke their oaths, and he was going to stay by the oath, whatever happened. He was a man of integrity, a man who would keep to an oath, as of course he didn't when he agreed to accept the Mise of Amiens, and then didn't when it went against him, which one of the points I've always found strongly against Montfort.
No, Simon was playing his own game, but just now, just to go into the events of 1261 and the quashing of the provisions. This goes on for 1 year. Henry berates the council. He basically says, I gave you a chance and you made a mess of things, so I have to take power back. And as Michael says, Simon says, well, I'm not going to live with all you perjurers. I'm going home. So he leaves for France, and he's more or less self-imposed exile. But it suits his purposes. He always had another home to go to.
Yeah, well, I think that's very significant, isn't it, that he spends almost as much time in France as in England during this period, and when he's supposed to be so engaged in English affairs. But I think, as I say, he was always one of these people who had this capacity to spread himself and spread his options. But what I was going to say was that I think it was John Madicott who made a very good point about Simon de Montfort during the struggle over the king's counter coup against the provisions of Oxford in 1261. And of course, I mean, there was obviously some opposition to the king's recovery of power, these counter sheriffs being appointed and so on. But as John Madicott says, Simon de Montfort must place some responsibility over the failure of opposition to the king's recovery of power, because I think Montfort's phrase was, he didn't pull out all the stops to save the provisions of Oxford in 1261. Now, that was partly because, of course, he was very interested in pursuing his case against Henry in the French court, and I think at that stage he periodically took his eye off the ball, and I think that's a very significant thing. It was a mistake which he didn't repeat. But I think it was a mistake.
That's true. He never repeated his mistakes. But so we get into 1262. Much is said that the realm is still very much disquieted and all that, and why Henry is going abroad and to France. And I more or less cheer Henry on. He's not gonna let dance to Simon's tune. He wants to go to France. He will. So he does. Peter of Savoy goes with him, a lot of counselors, and it more or less has to do with the peace treaty and also arbitration in front of Margaret over Simon's grievances. But Peter of Savoy doesn't come back, does he, John?
No, he starts to become very much involved in affairs in Helvetia. So again, it's that sort of thing we talked about with Simon, that he's away at the French court, is that Peter gets drawn increasingly away to Helvetia.
And Richard de Clare dies at this time. So who is dominant on the council? I mean, there's no Simon, there's no Peter, there's no Richard. Roger, the Earl of Norfolk, he's completely useless.
One of the other ones who dies about this time is the man we've hardly mentioned at all. You remember in 1258-59, there was the edict that no aliens should have castles, and yet several retained them, one being Matthias Bezel, who held on to Gloucester, but the other one is John de Plessis, who was a Norman.
Right, yeah.
Was obviously liked by both sides. He seems to have been a likable person. He was seen to be accepted by both sides when they're electing their various groups and so on. And he dies in 1263, so his influence has gone. So that's one more person we have to remove from the.
Right, and the abbot of Westminster dies in the epidemic of 58. So Henry loses a lot of close allies in the church, and this will be
Archbishop Boniface goes on papal business.
Yes. Right, and this will be very significant because as these bishops die during the Reform period, Simon de Montfort and his allies somehow managed to insinuate people of their thinking into these new vacant bishoprics. For example, very clearly Richard Gravesend of Lincoln, Dihort Montfortian, Bergstead in Chichester, and this, of course, will be the new basis of Simon's power. He has these bishops who support him wholeheartedly. And so I would like to ask, what is the attraction between these bishops and Simon? I mean, we know he's a great friend of Walter Cantilupe, probably the most senior bishop. Walter certainly played a part in having these bishops come over to his side. But could there have been a more or less a charismatic factor? Like they meet Simon, maybe he's very physically imposing. He was said by contemporaries to have a very pleasing manner of speaking and so forth. So could it have all been something that we just can't see from this distance of time?
Sophie Ambler did her PhD thesis on the Montfortian bishops, And I think she goes into great detail on this. But it does seem to me that Simon got a reputation from being a man of piety. I wonder, for instance, go right forward to Evesham when he dies and they find he's got a hair shirt on.
Yes.
Was he wearing a shirt forever, or did he just put it on the day
Oh,
of the
no, Michael, no. He put that on 10 minutes before the battle, guaranteed.
That's what I think. Other
But,
people might what he did.
But Ambler's work on the bishops, a lot of this goes back to the insinuation of politics into church affairs under Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who of course was a student of the Paris schools, and that together with the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. But of course, these bishops all had a dark side. Langton especially. I mean, he was one of the great oppressor of the Jews during Hurley's early reign. Cantilupe, a great pluralist. His nephew Thomas, who gets only grade A marks from David Carpenter in his books, another notorious pluralist. I think he held as many as 10 rich benefices when he was writing his treatise on royal oppression. So
he does become a saint in the end, doesn't he?
Yeah. Can I just say something? This is not the only explanation for the radical attitude of some of the new bishops, but you do realize that one of the most extraordinary actions of royal assertion of regalian control and interference in a bishopric happened during the period of the provisions of Oxford, during the enforced absence of Aymer, because of course, the council try and depose Aymer, and of course they take the bishopric of Winchester into the king's hands. And it's really, and they also tried to manipulate dismissal of archdeacons and all sorts of things. It's a very, very sort of sweeping demonstration of royal power over a bishopric. And I just wonder whether, this is of course totally paradoxical that that this explains, this helps to explain why, in some respects, why of course you have this and this clerical sort of, as it were, explosion. Of course, and also hadn't Boniface been organising provincial synods as well in this period? And there'd been a whole sort of series of episcopal complaints about royal interference in election.
Right.
So
I mean, but this is an argument that goes back centuries. This struggle between.
I know, but still, I mean, it was one of these things that.
But interesting was how the Montfortians they became so desperate that they tried to show in their arguments before Louis that one of the reasons why the provisions of Oxford were necessary was that so they could go on crusade. That
yes,
that crusade was so important, and that Henry had failed to go on crusade, or he had blocked it. Of course, the papacy is not buying it, because they know well under their auspices that the crusade is now in Sicily. It's not going to be the Holy Land, and Henry is very much a part of it. So I think these bishops, in a lot of ways, they were new to the scene, and I think there was just something in Simon that they were drawn to, that maybe he could win them the independence from royal authority that they all yearned for. Or maybe he was just such a charismatic leader. I mean,
a lot of the new bishops were also, they weren't career royal civil servants, were they? I think,
right.
Right, saying a number of them were academics, and so no doubt this affected the way in which they perhaps took a more independent and sort of grand line along the lines of reformed papacy and so on.
Because in the end, when there is no peace enacted after the Battle of Lewes, in fact, the English church became more or less an independent church. I mean, and I think maybe that's one of the things that they were after by supporting Simon. But anyways, let's not get too far ahead of us. So Now we move into 1263.
Yeah, but can I just say before that, don't you think this is an extraordinary moral gesture of Henry going over to France to sort things out in 1262, or attempt to sort things out? It's extraordinary, really, behavior by the king. And it does show, I think, that Henry sincerely did try and reach a sort of some sort of peace, I think. I don't think this is just gesture politics.
Well, if you look at the oration that was written during the 1258 reform period, most historians ascribe it to the baronial council, which I think is nonsense. I think that's clearly Henry's work with his clerks, because that oration talks about the idea of bringing peace to the world, about three kings and so forth. I mean, this just speaks all of what Henry is about. He wants this peace, a lot of it due to his piety, a lot of it due to his past experience as a boy king, so forth. So I think Henry and Louis are very sincere about creating peace between their two realms, which in the end will help the Christian world at that time.
And the crusade as well.
And the
I think.
crusade, right. So
Yes.
And we
So I
should
think-
remember the influence of the two sisters as well, of course, Marguerite and Eleanor.
Yes.
right. So
But
I think
just-
that this idea that Henry just went off on a frivolous trip, I think that in itself is a bit frivolous. But the end result, of course, was a bit disastrous, because there was an epidemic at the court, and then he does something very extraordinary. I mean, Simon de Montfort goes to England. He has somehow acquired a papal bull which confirms the provisions of Oxford. We think now he had an agent working in Rome who more or less took advantage of the death of Pope Alexander and the ascension of Pope Urban to more or less hoodwink this papal bull to use at this opportune time. And Philip Bassett, who is the justiciar at that time, he's warning of this new dissension because of Simon's presence. But Henry goes off on a pilgrimage to the Cathedral of Reims, because that's he liked his pilgrimages. And David Carpenter criticizes him harshly, because John Mansell, the advisors, are saying, look, you got to go home and deal with this problem. And Henry said, I will deal with this problem after my pilgrimage. I'm not going to dance to his tune. So, but of course, after the pilgrimage, it's quite clear that danger is on the horizon. There's the Welsh uprising, and Henry asks Louis, can you please find some way to mollify this very angry baron of mine? But of course, Louis himself fails. So I don't know if anyone would have succeeded with trying to bring Simon on board with royal authority.
But the interesting thing about 1263, as Hugh showed years ago, is this make a huge difference, because the violence is now not against the Poitevins alone, it's against the Savoyards as well. And not only the Savoyards, Matthias Bezel has been the sheriff and constable in Gloucester for years and years, has lands in Gloucester for over 20 years, and yet he is captured and taken to Erdsley in Herefordshire, as is Pierre d'Aqueblanche, the bishop, the Savoyard bishop of Hereford. So in other words, the violence has spread to the Savoyards as well as the Lusignans. All aliens are up for grabs, except of course for Simon de Montfort.
Right.
I think that what happened was that a series of people, as it were, come to the surface who are discontented. You have the sort of group of people who have been ousted from Edward's household, the Roger de Leyburn group, Roger de Clifford, Hamel Lestrange, and so on. And you have also, I think, a group of young barons who had been wards of both the Lusignans and the Savoyards, who I think they're sort of coming of age, and I think very discontented because perhaps I think they felt that they didn't get justice out of the baronial reform movement, curiously enough. And then, of course, I think, in many ways, of course, Henry had papered over the cracks in his recovery of power in 1261, and a number of these compromises start to sort of unravel. And basically what happens is Simon de Montfort returns to England, doesn't he? And he sort of somehow pulls all these people together, gradually, well, quite quickly actually, into a movement.
There are other factors at work there. Henry's illness, a big factor. Edward's delay in coming home. Richard of Cornwall coming home dissatisfied from his tenure in Germany and possibly threw in his lot with Simon. And so you have all these factors, and also the timing of his offensive to strike when Henry has no money. So when we put all these, and of course,
we can also just add at this point. We can also just add at this point that this is sort of serendipity of events, dear boy, events, is that Peter of Savoy, who is part of Henry's support network, suddenly becomes that some of the Count of Savoy. His nephew Boniface dies, and Peter is now no longer necessarily involved in English affairs. He's got a whole county of Savoy to run.
So a lot of factors.
So that takes his focus away just at that moment.
And also, I think Henry's quarrel with the Earl of Gloucester as well, this mishandling of young Gilbert de Clare, was, of course, extremely serious. I mean, oddly enough, William de Valence had in one sense, done his first good deed of his life, really. He'd sort of intervened on behalf of Gilbert.
With Gilbert, what we see happening in 1263, Gilbert is all about himself. I mean, we even see him trying to supplant Simon as the leader of the opposition. So he was just a bad element to come along at that time. Again, another factor in all of this. But
I think no. I mean, Gilbert de Clare was, the most important English baron, basically. So
he's fighting with his mother. He's fighting with his tenants. He's fighting with everybody. So not just Henry.
Well, yes, he was, but and I think he had, but but nevertheless, I think that the alliance between Simon de Montfort and Gilbert de Clare was very, very important indeed.
And let's never forget that Simon was 35 years older than Gilbert. I mean, he's not going to treat him as an equal. But anyway, so the 1263 offensive is successful. But two very important reasons beyond these disgruntled barons joining forces together is the rallying of this down with the alien call, because England at this time is undergoing severe, I don't want to say the population has exploded more or less. So we can imagine that there are a lot of drifters about in the country at this time, a lot of people on the edges of urban society and so forth, and they are just ripe for picking for Simon. So they all more or less join his banner. But on the other side, he needs the bishops. He needs their sanction, because they're the ones who ultimately go to Henry and say, all right, look, you've lost this phase, and we're going to impose this condition that all aliens out. The bishops are actually promoting this plan for Simon, so Henry has no choice but to.
Well, one of the things, of course, one of their complaints, wasn't it, was the papal provisions of that, at the sweep of his papal wand, the king, the Pope could catapult in foreign clergy, couldn't he? And lucrative benefices in England, and And I think that that's one of the things they really didn't like.
Right. And what about Henry de Montfort? What about what he got under his father? Same thing, just
Oh yes, well,
hypocrisy. So, but anyway,
well, I think so.
so Henry and Edward together, they more or less win back the disgruntled barons, and Simon is soon isolated again. And he and his remaining
what I would like to say is that I think Montfort was at the head of a small but very powerful, as it were, clique or party of people that he brought together. I'm not sure about the mass of the English baronage and their attitude in 1263, because, as you know, that Montfort's first taste of government collapsed quite rapidly, really.
Yeah.
And you see a royalist resurgence the end of 1263 and early 1264. But nevertheless, it was a very, very powerful coalition.
It was,
and
but
only some of the bishops supported Simon
right.
de Montfort. It's just a coalition, isn't it?
But it collapsed because now Edward understands what's at stake, and he joins his father into, making sure that they put down this rebellion, if you like. So it comes to December 1263, and they arrange a truce, and they agree to let Louis decide on the provisions of Oxford, whether to let them stand or to quash them. Now, this has been more or less interpreted as a last stand for Simon and his cohort. Certainly, when you see Henry's brief that is sent to Louis, it is very brief. It's just, the provisions have caused these problems, this much damage, and I seek so forth. Then the baronial brief is very long, and it attempts to tie Louis's hands by saying to quash the provisions of Oxford is the same as quashing Magna Carta, and we're not going to have that. And also, the provisions of Oxford are our safeguard for the upcoming crusade and so forth. Of course, Louis is having none of it, and he quashes them. So, but as Michael mentioned earlier, Simon swore an oath that he would follow whatever ruling Louis gave. And he didn't. After calling everybody else a perjurer, he more or less decides to join the clique. So what we have now is war. But yeah, so John, so Peter of Savoy didn't come back for the war. Was he so busy in his new county?
He's Count of Savoy. He's completely and totally. He has a lot of problems in Savoy at that point. We have an encroachment from the Habsburgs in the north. There is a power vacuum with the previous, so the Germanic people to the north, and he has problems with the local bishops trying to extend their temporal authority. So he has a lot of problems on his plate in Savoy.
Right. Yeah. Did he send any troops, or do you know of?
Well, he does later, but not at this point. So it's not until after the Battle of Lewes that's coming up. So at this point, he's really concerned with the Habsburgs more than anything else.
And Michael, now all these aliens who found a home and patronage under Henry, where do they stand in this coming conflict? Are they almost all uniformly behind Henry?
I don't know of any that were against Henry. Some, of course, had died off over the years, as I mentioned. One of the Imbert Puges, a Savoyard, for instance, he died. He got the disease that the king was affected in Paris in the 61, 62, when he went for that journey. The Savoyards, the Poitevins, William of Sancta Romina, went abroad and didn't come back until after the war. But I don't think, and I'm not quite sure what happened to people like Chavant and so on. He was certainly with Northampton, but whether they went to Pevensey, as I think John you seem to think there was a possibility they were in Pevensey.
Right.
Well,
It's a possibility. We have a number of the Savoyards other than Peter of Savoy. We don't necessarily know where they are because they don't appear in any of the records. Famously, Otto the grandson as well. But yeah, it's there is this general coalition of the Savoyards in England still trying to protect their interests and be on the royalist side.
Well, famously, Henry more or less chases Simon all over the south of England with Edward, but it comes down to the Battle of Lewes, and with support.
Can I just sort of say something? It was Henry who actually started the war, wasn't it, in 1264? And I think that's quite interesting, isn't it?
Sorry, how did he start?
Well, it's he who actually unfurls his standard, doesn't he?
Standard,
well, yeah, I mean, they later declared Northampton to be the official start of the war. Yes, that's true.
And I think really that's the work of the Lord Edward, isn't it? And the sort of gradual influence that Edward is having now, stiffening the kingdom.
Okay, he probably has input from Edward as well as Richard, but the final decision is Henry, and I see him as very belligerent at this phase. When we see what the chroniclers are reporting, for example, Battle Abbey, I mean, Henry is in a very warlike mood. He's not having any more of this. So I think he's calling the shots. But
you may be right. But I mean, there was that famous episode, wasn't it, when he ordered the beheading of a whole load of peasants, didn't he?
The insurgents
in the Weald. Which most unlike Henry. It's a bit like the treatment of the garrison at Bedford, wasn't it?
Right. But it was said that Richard of Cornwall also pushed for him to carry out the execution. So these two brothers weren't the pushovers that they're often made to be in the annals.
Well, Henry had avoided this for as long as he possibly
could. Yeah, sure. But the end result, of course, is disaster. The battle starts off well.
There is, I think, a bit of evidence, I think, that the king's party was growing in power, actually. You can start to see some evidence of people sort of going back to the king's side in amongst knights of the southwest, for example. I mean, it's very difficult, but I have seen some cases of people, as it were, defecting from the Montfortian camp. I think it's quite, of course, important, I think, to say that. And of course, Edward's knights have been reconciled one day. People like Roger de Laban, for example, and Roger de Clifford, these were rather sort of violent, vicious sort of types, So the royalist camp is starting to have a bit more grist to it.
Right. And of course, the battle was more or less won until Edward took off on his joyride. But anyway,
yes, the king was winning by the time of the Battle of Lewes. Yes, you're absolutely right. He was chasing.
These were the Londoners, of course, who've been pelting his mother with various bits of fruit and goodness knows what else from London Bridge. Of course, Edward was not the forgiving sort.
No.
And
but this is just another mistake of Edward's that costs his parents. But anyway, so
can I just say one thing? I think you thought that David Carpenter is full of admiration for Simon de Montfort. What he actually says in the first sentence of his summary of his life was that he was the most remarkable man ever to dignify and defile the English political scene. So, he can see that there are problems in Montfort.
Right, but in his summation in the midst of the book, it's basically 90% admiration and 10% reserve. And also, I was just reading, what I wanted to say also is that he has the same view about Edward. And when he was talking about Edward's, one of his legendary feats with Adam Gurdon and all that, and then he ends it with, nobody ever talked about Henry in these terms, like in legendary terms and so forth. And I think that's a problem that a lot of people have with Henry as opposed to Simon. he seems like just this ordinary fellow. I mean, he's just not going out to make a big show of anything unless it has something to do with the piety of the realm.
But I think Simon de Montfort did have military ability. I mean, you see it, don't you, at the Battle of Lewes, where he, for example, he instructed his standard to be put on a cart so it would move back and forth, something like that. Wasn't this? This is one of these kind of ruses, which of course we now know were perfectly acceptable in chivalric society, because to use the tricks of military experience was perfectly okay.
Right. He got that experience from the Albigensian Crusade. If you look at the Albigensian Crusade, that really set the standard for what knightly warfare became in the 13th century, and Simon was a party to it. But and
I think Montfort also had in his household knights who were training as well. We just don't know very much about them. But if you look at some of the miracle stories, there's a young West Country baron, for example, who talks about something that happened, a couple of miracles that happened when he was visiting Simon de Montfort's one of his manors, and I think this makes me think that this man, Henry de Pomeroy from Devon, had been perhaps training, because he was just about the sort of age to be training, and I just think that Montfort had a kind of school of training knights like William Marshall.
Right, but and David Carpenter makes the point that there's no evidence Henry ever attended a tournament. There's no evidence that Simon ever attended a tournament.
No, there isn't.
Either.
No, that's very odd.
We can make a lot about these things. Anyway, we're coming to the end, so that's perfect. We will pick up next time with the victory at Lewes and Simon de Montfort's regime and his famous parliaments. Whether that happens next month or the next, I'm not quite sure, because I'm going to the States for 3 weeks at the end of next month. I haven't been there for 13 years, and I'm coming back to this, unbelievable situation that exists there right now. So will be very interesting, but we'll be in touch about how to continue and so forth. But
do you think the Democrats will dump Biden?
If they have the courage, they will. What I saw last night was so painful. I felt sorry for Biden.
There's talk about it in the English press, isn't it, that they're going to do something like that.
He should never have been in that situation in the first place. It's like every family that has that very old patriarch, how to get him to step aside. And we saw this on full stage last night. It was horrible.
But we do sort of see in a way in Simon de Montfort, as he's getting older, he's more patriarchal, isn't he? The young men are looking towards him. And,
Biden is younger than me.
But I think the best quip of all last night I have to give to Trump when he said, "I don't know what he said, and I don't think he knows either." So
that was quite funny.
Clive Neal once told me that he thought that Montfort had this sort of charm over younger knights, and this was very important, And of course, Thomas Wykes talks about this, young knights,
the wax in his hand
to Montfort's cause.
Right. Yeah, he molded them. So this, as we were saying with the bishops, I wonder if Simon had that charismatic ability that we just can't see.
Definitely
at this stage.
It's hard to see at this distance.
All right, gentlemen, that was great. Enjoyed it. So we're going to pick up part 3 sometime later this summer. I'll let everyone know how we'll do and so forth. So have a good time till then.
Thanks.
And enjoy and take
Thank
care.
you very much, and all the best to everybody. Now have a good summer.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Enjoy America.
Okay.
Yes, enjoy America. Bye-bye, John G.
Bye, John G.
France.
Bye.